Margaret sat quietly at her kitchen table, staring at the pile of envelopes in front of her. They were not letters from friends or family. They were bills. Some of them were already stamped in red ink marked overdue. Her hands trembled as she picked one up, then put it down again. The house felt colder than usual, though it was springtime. It wasn't just the air that chilled her. It was the silence that had followed her since the day her husband died. She had never imagined her life would turn out this way. Margaret and her husband had built their small world together with dreams of safety, love, and a simple future. But now he was gone, taken by illness too quickly for her to even prepare, and she was left with nothing but memories and debts. Friends and neighbors came at first with kind words, casseroles, and gentle promises to visit. But as the weeks passed, their visits grew fewer, and Margaret was left to face the harsh reality alone. The money in their savings account disappeared faster than she expected. Funeral costs, hospital bills, the mortgage, everything piled up like an unstoppable wave. She tried to find work, but it wasn't easy. She was in her late 50s with no degree or fancy skills. Most of the jobs she applied for either turned her away politely or never called back at all. Even the ones who showed some interest eventually chose younger applicants who could work longer hours for less pay. Margaret sold what she could: old furniture, her husband's tools, even her wedding china set. Each time she parted with something, she felt like she was giving away another piece of her past. Yet no matter how much she sold, it never seemed to be enough. She would sit at night with a calculator, trying to stretch every dollar, but the numbers always betrayed her. The walls of the house, once filled with laughter and warmth, now seemed to echo her worries back at her. She often went to bed hungry, convincing herself she wasn't that hungry after all, and that a cup of tea was enough for dinner. It wasn't pride that kept her from asking for help, it was fear. Fear of becoming a burden. Fear of admitting to anyone just how bad things had gotten. The Margaret everyone knew was strong, dependable, the kind of woman who could bake bread while humming and make her home feel like a safe place. But this Margaret, the one sitting in the dark staring at unpaid bills, felt like a stranger. One rainy afternoon, she sat by the window, watching the water stream down the glass. She thought of her husband, of how he used to whistle while fixing the leaky roof or laugh when the dog tracked mud inside the house. Those little moments had once annoyed her, but now she would give anything to relive them. She whispered into the quiet room, "What am I supposed to do now?" The rain answered with steady tapping, but no comfort. Just when it seemed that life had squeezed out every last bit of hope, a letter arrived in the mail that didn't look like a bill. The envelope was thick with a formal seal on the back. Margaret opened it with shaking hands, expecting maybe more bad news. But instead, the letter inside spoke of inheritance. A distant relative, someone she barely remembered meeting at a family gathering years ago, had passed away. This relative, an uncle of her late husband, had left her a cabin in the mountains. Margaret blinked at the words, hardly believing them. A cabin inheritance? It seemed impossible. She had never even thought much about this relative. Why would he leave anything to her? She read the letter again and again until the words sank in. The cabin wasn't described as anything grand. It was likely old, maybe even falling apart. But still, it was a property, a place she could call her own, and in that moment it felt like a small piece of light in her otherwise dark world. At first, Margaret wasn't sure what to do. She had no money to travel, no idea what awaited her in the mountains, and no guarantee that the cabin would even be livable. But as she sat there thinking about her growing debts, she realized she had nothing left to lose. Staying where she was meant drowning in bills and memories she couldn't afford. The cabin, however uncertain, offered a chance to escape, to start fresh, maybe even to heal. The decision didn't come easily. Margaret spent nights pacing the house, weighing her options. She packed a suitcase, then unpacked it. She imagined herself living alone in some broken-down shack, isolated from the world. But she also imagined herself breathing clean air, waking up to the sound of birds instead of the ringing of creditors on the phone. Finally, with a deep breath, she decided to go. She sold the last few things she could spare and bought a bus ticket. The day she left, she locked the door to her house for the final time. She looked at the small, worn-down home, remembering birthdays, anniversaries, and quiet evenings with her husband. Tears filled her eyes, but she knew she couldn't stay. She whispered goodbye and walked away, suitcase in hand, heart heavy yet strangely lighter at the same time. The bus ride to the mountains was long and winding. Margaret sat quietly, gazing out the window at rolling hills and tall trees. For the first time in months, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel: curiosity. What would the cabin look like? What stories did it hold? She knew it wouldn't solve her problems overnight, but maybe it would give her space to breathe, to think, to find a new way forward. When the bus finally stopped at a small mountain town, Margaret stepped off with her suitcase. The air smelled different, fresh, sharp, and clean. A kind local offered her directions, and she set out on the final leg of her journey. Each step brought her closer to the unknown, and though fear lingered in her chest, so did hope. Margaret had no idea then that the cabin she was walking toward would change her life in ways she could never imagine. For now, all she knew was that she was no longer standing still. She was moving forward, and for the first time since her husband's death, she felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a future waiting for her. The narrow dirt road curved between tall pines as Margaret made her way toward the cabin. Each step echoed with a mixture of nervousness and curiosity. Her suitcase wheels struggled against the uneven ground, but she kept pulling it along, determined to reach her new home. The mountains surrounded her like quiet guardians, their peaks hidden in soft clouds. For the first time in months, she wasn't staring at walls filled with unpaid bills or listening to the buzz of a broken ceiling fan. She was breathing in crisp, cool air that smelled of pine and damp earth. When she finally reached the cabin, Margaret stopped and just stared. It stood at the edge of a small clearing, half hidden by trees. The wood was dark and weathered, the roof sagging in places and the windows dusty from years of neglect. It wasn't beautiful in the way of polished houses in town, but it had a certain rugged charm, as if it had been waiting patiently for someone to come back and care for it. Margaret's heart lifted and sank at the same time. This was hers, her inheritance, but it also looked like it needed more work than she had imagined. The door creaked loudly as she pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled of dust, wood, and something faintly sweet like old dried herbs. Cobwebs hung in the corners, and the floorboards groaned beneath her feet. But the place wasn't empty. An old rocking chair sat near the fireplace, its cushions faded. A small table with uneven legs rested by the window. A bookshelf stood against the wall, half filled with worn novels and a few forgotten trinkets. It felt strange, like stepping into someone else's memories. Margaret placed her suitcase down and walked slowly through each room. The cabin wasn't big, just a living area, a small kitchen, a bedroom, and a loft upstairs that seemed to be used for storage. Everything looked as if time had stopped there years ago. Dust covered the surfaces, but under the dust, she saw pieces of a life. An old quilt folded neatly on the bed, a lantern hanging by the door, a collection of hand-carved wooden animals on a shelf. She wondered about the man who had lived here, her husband's uncle, and why he had chosen to leave this cabin to her of all people. At first, she felt overwhelmed. The cabin clearly needed work. The roof leaked in one corner, the fireplace was filled with ashes, and the windows rattled whenever the wind blew. She had no money for repairs, no tools beyond a hammer she had brought from home. She sat on the rocking chair, hugging her arms tightly around herself. For a moment, she wanted to cry, but then she reminded herself, this was still better than where she had come from. Here, at least, there were no calls from creditors, no reminders of what she had lost. Here she could start fresh. The first night was hard. The cabin groaned with unfamiliar sounds, the wind whistling through cracks and small animals scurrying across the roof. Margaret lay awake on the bed, staring at the ceiling, wrapped in the old quilt she had found. She felt both alone and oddly safe at the same time. The darkness outside was thick, but the stars she glimpsed through the window seemed brighter than any she had seen before. Eventually, she drifted into an uneasy sleep, dreaming of her husband and of wide, empty landscapes. The next morning, Margaret rose with the sun. She decided that if this cabin was going to be her home, she had to take care of it. She opened the windows to let fresh air sweep out the stale smell. She rolled up her sleeves, grabbed an old broom she found leaning against the wall, and began cleaning. Dust flew in clouds, making her cough and laugh at herself. She scrubbed the kitchen counters, wiped down the shelves, and shook out the quilt in the sunlight. Bit by bit, the cabin began to feel less like a forgotten relic and more like a place where she could live. Cleaning uncovered small surprises. Behind a stack of books, she found a faded photograph of a young man standing proudly beside a horse. On a high shelf, she discovered a tin box filled with rusty nails and buttons. In a drawer, she stumbled upon a small pocket knife, its handle worn smooth from years of use. Each object made her feel a strange connection to the man who had once lived there. She didn't know much about him, but the cabin seemed to whisper parts of his story. That evening, she tried to make her first meal in the cabin. The kitchen was simple, just a wood-burning stove, a few pots, and some mismatched plates. She boiled water, made a small pot of soup from what she had brought, and sat by the fireplace to eat. The taste wasn't fancy, but it was warm, and she felt proud of herself for making it work. As the days passed, Margaret developed a routine. She woke early, cleaned, gathered wood, and made simple meals. She learned how to light the stove properly and how to sweep ashes from the fireplace. She discovered a small stream nearby where she could collect fresh water. The work was tiring, but it filled her days and gave her something she had been missing: purpose. Every task, no matter how small, reminded her that she was capable of surviving. Still, there were moments when loneliness hit hard. The silence of the mountains was both comforting and heavy. Sometimes she would sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the trees sway in the wind, and talk out loud to her husband as if he were sitting beside her. She told him about her day, about the cabin, about how she was trying to be strong. She imagined him smiling, encouraging her the way he always had. One afternoon, while sweeping the loft upstairs, Margaret noticed a loose floorboard in the corner. At first, she thought nothing of it. Old cabins often had uneven boards. But when her broom caught on it, she knelt down and pressed against it. The board shifted slightly. Her curiosity grew. With some effort, she pried it up and revealed a small hidden space beneath. Inside lay a wooden box, its surface scratched and worn as if it had been hidden for a very long time. Her heart raced as she pulled it out. The box was locked, but the lock was old and rusted. With the pocket knife she had found earlier, she managed to force it open. Inside was something she never expected: an old leather-bound journal. Its cover was cracked with age and its pages were yellowed. She turned the first page carefully, and in bold, uneven handwriting she saw a name. It was not her relative's name. It was the name of a man she recognized from local stories, an outlaw from the 1800s, one she had heard about in passing but never thought much of. Margaret sat frozen, the journal heavy in her lap. She flipped through a few more pages, her eyes widening at the words inside. This was not just idle rambling. It was a record of a life lived on the run, of crimes committed, of escapes barely made. And hidden among the tales were references to something more, something about a mine, gold, and a secret that had never been revealed. She closed the journal quickly, her heart pounding. For a long time she sat in silence, listening to the cabin creak around her. She had come here expecting only dust and solitude, but instead she had uncovered a mystery. A piece of history was lying in her hands, and it hinted at a fortune that might still be hidden somewhere in the mountains. Margaret didn't know what to think yet. She was tired, overwhelmed, and unsure if she should believe the words of a long-dead outlaw. But as she looked around the cabin, the place she had almost given up on, she realized her story was only beginning. Margaret sat in the loft with the journal resting in her lap, her hands trembling as she touched the old leather cover. The weight of it felt heavier than it should, as if it carried not just words but secrets long buried. She ran her fingers across the uneven handwriting on the first page again, repeating the name quietly to herself. It was a name she had only heard in passing from stories whispered in town when she was younger. Old tales about an outlaw who had robbed banks, stolen horses, and disappeared into the mountains to hide from lawmen. No one ever knew what had become of him. For a long while, Margaret didn't move. The cabin was silent except for the soft creaking of the floor and the distant sound of birds outside. She felt torn between fear and curiosity. Part of her wanted to shove the journal back under the floorboard and pretend she had never seen it. Another part of her, the part that had been carrying the heavy burden of loneliness and hardship, wanted desperately to know more. Finally, with a deep breath, she opened the book again and began to read. The words were messy, written in a hurried scrawl, but they told a story that drew her in immediately. The outlaw wrote about his life on the run, about nights spent under the stars with nothing but a fire and a stolen horse for company. He described shootouts and escapes, betrayals by friends, and near misses with the law. His words painted pictures so vivid that Margaret could almost see the dust of the trails, hear the sound of hooves pounding across rocky ground, and feel the constant fear of being hunted. But what caught her attention most was the way he wrote about something hidden. Between the stories of robberies and escapes, there were entries that hinted at a discovery he had made in the mountains: a cave, a shaft, a place rich with gold. At first, Margaret thought he was just boasting, exaggerating like many men in old stories. But the more she read, the more detailed it became. He described the rocks, the rivers, the way the sun hit certain cliffs at dawn. He even sketched rough drawings in the margins: mountain ridges, crooked trees, streams winding like snakes. Margaret leaned closer to the pages, her heart racing as she traced the lines with her fingertip. Could it be real? Had he truly found a gold mine somewhere near these very mountains? If so, could it still be there waiting after all these years? She shook her head, trying to calm herself. It seemed impossible. Yet she couldn't ignore the strange pull of the words. For months she had been living in despair, with nothing to look forward to but unpaid bills and long nights of loneliness. Now for the first time she felt a spark of excitement, a mystery laid out before her. As evening fell, Margaret lit a small lamp and kept reading. Some entries were angry, written in jagged lines about men who had betrayed him, about lawmen closing in, about the loneliness of running. Others were softer, filled with reflections about the land itself, how the mountains gave him peace even while he lived in fear. Then, near the middle of the book, she found an entry that made her catch her breath. It described in detail how he had stumbled upon a hidden mine while hiding from a posse. He wrote of veins of gold shining faintly in the dim light of his lantern, of the thrill and terror of discovering such wealth while knowing he could never claim it openly. Margaret pressed the journal to her chest, her mind racing. She thought of her empty bank account, the debts left behind, the hopelessness that had haunted her. Was it possible that this journal was offering her a way out? She laughed nervously at the thought. It sounded absurd, like something from a novel, not real life. And yet the outlaw's words were right there in her hands. The days that followed were filled with an unusual energy. Margaret woke earlier, eager to return to the journal. She read page after page, carefully piecing together the clues. Some parts were frustrating, with references that made little sense: the crooked pine, the canyon that swallows the sun, 3 stones stacked like brothers. Other parts were clearer, pointing to rivers and valleys she thought she might recognize from her walks near the cabin. She began to keep her own notebook, copying down phrases and sketches, determined to make sense of it. The more she read, the more she felt as though the outlaw was speaking directly to her. His words, though written more than a century ago, carried a raw honesty that touched her. He was a criminal, yes, but he was also a man who had lived with regret, fear, and a strange kind of hope. Margaret found herself wondering about his life. Did he ever imagine that someone like her would be reading his words so many years later? Did he hope someone would find his secret? Or did he intend to keep it hidden forever? One afternoon, as she sat by the stream near the cabin, she opened the journal again. She traced the sketch of a mountain ridge with her finger and looked up at the horizon. For the first time, she noticed how the peaks around her matched the shapes in the drawing. A thrill shot through her. The outlaw had been here, maybe even near this very stream. The idea that she was standing in the same place where he once walked made her heart pound. But along with excitement came fear. If the journal was true, if there really was a hidden mine filled with gold, then she wasn't the only one who might want to find it. She remembered the stories of treasure hunters, of people willing to do anything for riches. Should she even try to follow the clues? Or was she putting herself in danger by digging into the past? That night, sleep did not come easily. Margaret lay awake, the journal on the table beside her, the wind whispering through the trees outside. She thought of her husband, of how he would have laughed at the idea of her chasing after an outlaw's lost gold. But she also thought of how he would have encouraged her to be brave, to try, to believe that she was stronger than she thought. The next morning, Margaret made a decision. She would not rush blindly into the mountains, but she would not ignore the journal either. She would study it carefully, take her time, and see where the clues led. She had nothing left to lose and perhaps everything to gain. She spent her days balancing chores at the cabin with hours of study. She walked the nearby trails, comparing them to the outlaw's sketches. She learned to look closely at the land, the bend of a river, the way shadows fell on the cliffs, the unique shape of certain trees. Every discovery, no matter how small, filled her with determination. In those quiet hours of searching and reading, something inside Margaret began to change. She no longer felt like a helpless widow drowning in debt. She felt like a woman with a purpose, carrying a secret that could alter her life. The outlaw's journal was no longer just a relic of the past. It was a map to possibility, a key to a future she had never imagined. Margaret closed the book one evening and looked around the cabin. The light of the fire flickered against the walls, and the old rocking chair creaked as she leaned back. For the first time in so long, she didn't feel trapped. She felt alive, as though the mountains themselves were whispering encouragement. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing. She was no longer afraid of it. And as she placed the journal carefully back into its box, she whispered to the empty room, "I will find out what you left behind." The next morning, Margaret woke before sunrise, her heart beating with a strange mixture of excitement and nervousness. She had spent weeks reading the journal, copying sketches and trying to understand the outlaw's clues, but today she felt ready to take her first real steps into the mountains. She packed a small backpack with essentials, a water bottle, some bread, a map, a flashlight, and the journal itself. She wore sturdy boots, pulled her coat tight, and stepped outside into the crisp morning air. The mountains stretched around her like a silent audience, watching as she began her journey. The trail near the cabin was overgrown in places, the grass reaching up to her knees and branches brushing against her arms. Margaret moved carefully, paying attention to the sketches in the journal. She looked for the crooked pine the outlaw had mentioned, the small stream that twisted like a snake through the valley, and the stones stacked like brothers. It was slow work, but each small discovery made her feel more confident. The land seemed to be guiding her, and she began to believe that she could find what the outlaw had hidden so long ago. By midday, Margaret had climbed higher than she had ever gone before. Her legs ached, her backpack felt heavier, but she refused to stop. She paused to drink from the stream and eat a piece of bread. The journal opened beside her as she compared the surrounding peaks to the drawings. It was astonishing to see how much had stayed the same over the years. The mountains were rugged and wild, just as they had been in the outlaw's time, and the air was fresh and clean. She felt a strange sense of connection, as if the mountains themselves were welcoming her. As she climbed further, the path became steeper and rockier. Margaret had to use her hands to steady herself on some parts, pulling herself up over large boulders and clinging to tree roots on narrow ridges. Fear and excitement mixed in her chest. At times she wanted to turn back, but the journal kept her moving forward. She reminded herself that this was not just a journey to find treasure. It was a test of her courage, her determination, and her ability to believe in herself. During one particularly challenging stretch, Margaret stumbled across an old, narrow path hidden beneath a tangle of bushes. It wasn't marked on any map, but in the journal, the outlaw had mentioned a trail less traveled. Her heart raced as she realized she might have found it. She pushed aside the branches and stepped carefully along the path. The air felt colder here, and the trees grew thicker, blocking much of the sunlight. But she pressed on, feeling as though she was walking directly into history, following in the footsteps of someone who had lived long before her. By late afternoon, she reached a small clearing. The journal's sketches seemed to match the place perfectly. 3 stones were stacked near a large oak, just as the outlaw had written. Margaret knelt to examine them, tracing the rough edges with her fingers. Her mind raced with possibilities. Could the next clue be nearby? She searched the area carefully, moving rocks, peering into crevices, and checking the base of trees. Each small detail mattered, and she realized that patience and observation were just as important as courage. As the sun began to dip behind the mountains, Margaret set up a small resting spot near the clearing. She ate a modest meal and sipped water, the journal open beside her. She read passages again and again, trying to make sense of every word. The outlaw's handwriting was difficult to decipher in places, but Margaret had grown accustomed to it. She noticed patterns, repeated phrases, and hints that seemed to point to a specific location further up the mountain. Her excitement grew, but so did her caution. She knew the mountains could be dangerous, with steep drops, loose rocks, and sudden changes in weather. She had to be careful. Night fell quickly, and the clearing grew dark and silent. Margaret had brought a small flashlight, but she decided to leave it off and sit quietly, listening to the sounds of the forest. Crickets chirped, an owl hooted in the distance, and the wind rustled through the trees. For a moment she felt completely alone, yet strangely connected to the place. It was as if the outlaw's spirit lingered here, guiding her and watching over her progress. She felt a deep sense of respect for the man, despite his past, and a growing determination to honor his story by following the clues responsibly. The next day, she continued higher into the mountains. The terrain became more rugged with steep cliffs and narrow ledges. Margaret moved slowly and carefully, using the journal as her guide. She noticed a small waterfall in the distance, exactly as the outlaw had described, and a narrow path leading behind it. She carefully made her way along the slippery rocks, holding her breath as water sprayed over her boots. The sense of adventure and danger thrilled her, but she also reminded herself to stay focused. One wrong step could be disastrous. Over the following days, Margaret developed a rhythm. She hiked during the day, read the journal by the stream or under trees during breaks, and slept in a small tent she had set up at night. She kept a careful record of her progress, making notes of landmarks, distances, and observations. Slowly, the clues in the journal began to form a pattern. She realized that the outlaw had designed them to be challenging on purpose, ensuring that only someone who paid attention and had patience could find the hidden location. Margaret felt proud of herself for keeping up, for noticing details others might have missed. Along the way, she faced small challenges that tested her determination. One afternoon, a sudden rainstorm soaked her clothes and made the path muddy and slippery. She slipped a few times, scraped her hands on rocks, and considered turning back. But then she saw the way the water reflected sunlight in a narrow canyon, just as the journal had described. She smiled through the rain, realizing that even obstacles could be part of the adventure, and pushed on. Each trial made her stronger, more confident, and more determined to reach her goal. Margaret also discovered the joy of small, quiet moments during her journey. She watched a family of deer cross a meadow, listened to the sound of a distant river, and marveled at the way sunlight filtered through the mountain trees. These moments reminded her why she had come to the mountains in the first place. It wasn't just about the journal or the possibility of gold. It was about reclaiming her life, finding courage she didn't know she had, and connecting with the natural world around her. As she approached the 5th day of her journey, Margaret noticed that the mountains were beginning to resemble the final sketches in the journal. The slopes became steeper, the cliffs sharper, and a narrow canyon appeared in the distance just as the outlaw had described it. Her excitement grew, but so did her caution. She had come too far to rush, and she knew that careful observation was crucial. Every rock, tree, and shadow could hold a clue. By late afternoon, she reached a narrow gorge. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the rocks. Margaret carefully examined the area, looking for signs that matched the journal's descriptions. Her hands trembled as she brushed aside loose stones near a small moss-covered wall. Suddenly, she found a faint marking, a symbol that looked just like one the outlaw had sketched. Her heart leapt. She was close, closer than she had ever been before. Margaret sat down on a flat rock, holding the journal in her hands. She let herself take a moment to breathe, to absorb the reality of what she had accomplished. Weeks of study, careful observation, and determination had led her here. She realized that the journey itself had changed her. She was no longer the frightened, lonely widow who had first arrived at the cabin. She was stronger, braver, and more capable than she had ever imagined. Margaret stepped cautiously into the narrow canyon, her boots crunching on loose stones. The walls rose high on either side, shadowed and mysterious. She could hear the faint sound of a stream somewhere deeper in the gorge, its water bubbling over rocks. Every step made her heart race. The outlaw's journal had led her this far, and she could feel that she was close, closer than ever to discovering the secret he had hidden so long ago. She moved slowly, keeping her eyes open for any signs that matched the sketches. There were marks in the rocks, moss patterns, and the bend of the stream just as the journal had described. Margaret realized that the outlaw had been incredibly clever. He had made sure that only someone patient, observant, and determined could follow the trail to the end. The thrill of solving a real-life puzzle filled her with energy she hadn't felt in years. After walking for what felt like hours, she came upon a pile of rocks stacked strangely at the base of a cliff. They looked almost artificial, as if someone had placed them there intentionally. Margaret's pulse quickened. The journal had mentioned 3 stones stacked like brothers near the entrance to the mine. Her hands trembled as she examined the rocks. There it was, a small, dark opening beneath them, partly hidden by moss and dirt. Her breath caught in her throat. Could this really be it? Margaret knelt down, brushing away dirt and debris from the entrance. The opening was small, but she could see that it continued inward, a narrow tunnel carved into the mountain. She hesitated. For a moment, the air thick with the scent of earth and age. Part of her wanted to run back to the cabin to forget the risks and simply return to the safety of her small, clean space. But another part, stronger than fear, urged her forward. She had come this far. She had studied the journal, followed the clues, and proved to herself that she could be brave. Now it was time to see what lay beyond. Using the flashlight she had packed, Margaret crawled into the tunnel. The air was cool and smelled of stone and minerals. Her heart pounded in her chest, echoing off the walls. Every inch she moved felt like a victory. As she went deeper, she noticed the faint glimmer of something in the rocks. Could it be the gold the outlaw had described? She held her breath, trying not to let excitement cloud her judgment. The tunnel widened into a small chamber. Margaret's soul. Flashlight illuminated the walls, rough and jagged, and in the corner, she saw the remains of what looked like a collapsed shaft. There were wooden beams now darkened with age and stones piled in a haphazard manner. The mine had clearly been used long ago, then abandoned. Margaret's heart raced as she explored further. There was no treasure lying in plain sight. No, piles of gold waiting for her. But the space itself was proof that the outlaw had been real, that his stories were true. She sat down on a stone, catching her breath, and ran her fingers over the walls. It was incredible to think that someone had discovered this hidden place more than a century ago. Margaret felt a deep respect for the man, despite his crimes. He had lived a dangerous, lonely life, but he had also left behind a legacy, a challenge for someone willing to follow the clues and see it through. Margaret spent hours exploring the mine. She carefully took notes, sketching the layout and documenting. The artifacts she found, an old lantern, some rusted tools, and a few wooden crates that had long since rotted away. She realized that the discovery itself was valuable, even if she did not find the fortune of gold she had imagined. Historians and treasure hunters would be interested in this site, and it could provide a glimpse into the life of a man who had become part of local legend. When she emerged from the mine, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the canyon. Margaret stood at the entrance, taking a deep breath. The air smelled sweet after the long, dusty crawl through the tunnel. She looked around, at the mountains, the trees, and the narrow gorge that had led her here. A sense of triumph washed over her. She had done something remarkable. She had faced fear, followed a century-old mystery, and uncovered a piece of history that had been hidden for generations. Over the next few weeks, Margaret returned to the mine several times. She documented everything she could and began contacting experts, historians, archaeologists, and local museum curators. They were amazed by her discovery. The mine itself, the artifacts, and the journal provided a story that captured the imagination of everyone who heard about it. Margaret realized that the true treasure was not just gold, but the journey she had taken and the courage she had found within herself. Word spread slowly at first. Journalists visited the small town near the cabin, eager to hear about the woman who had followed the outlaw's journal into the mountains. Treasure hunters came, respectful but curious, hoping to see the site for themselves. Margaret welcomed them carefully, ensuring that the mine was preserved and protected. She shared her story, emphasizing that the journey had taught her more than any gold ever could. People were inspired by her bravery, determination, and the way she had turned hardship into discovery. Life in the cabin changed after that. Margaret was no longer just a lonely widow struggling with debt. She became a guide of sorts, sharing her knowledge of the mountains and the mine with those who were interested. She still lived simply, maintaining her routines, cooking her meals, and caring for the cabin. But now there was purpose and community around her. People respected her for her courage, for following through on a challenge that most would have abandoned long ago. One quiet evening, Margaret sat on the porch of the cabin, the journal resting on her lap. The sky was painted with pinks and oranges, the mountains glowing softly in the last light of day. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the grief she had carried, the financial struggles, the loneliness, and she realized that each hardship had prepared her for this moment. Without them, She might never have had the courage to follow the journal, to climb the mountains, to discover the mine. Margaret smiled to herself, thinking of the outlaw and the legacy he had left behind. She didn't condone his crimes, but she understood his determination, his resourcefulness, and his desire to leave something hidden, something lasting. And in a way, she felt connected to him, as if his story and her story had intertwined across time. That night, as she prepared for bed, Margaret placed the journal back in its box and tucked it safely under a floorboard. She knew she would return to it, study it again, and perhaps even uncover more details about the mine. But for now, she felt a deep sense of peace. The cabin, the mountains, and the hidden mine had given her a new life, one filled with purpose, courage, and hope. Margaret had arrived at the cabin a lonely, bankrupt widow, unsure of what the future would hold. She had discovered a secret from the past, faced the challenges of the mountains, and uncovered a hidden treasure of courage, determination, and self-reliance. In the end, the journey had changed her in ways she could never have imagined. She had not only found the mine, she had found herself. The mountains stood silent around her, ancient and strong, as if acknowledging her accomplishment. Margaret gazed at the horizon, the sky darkening with the first stars of evening. She whispered quietly, "Thank you," knowing that the cabin, the journal, and the outlaw's story had given her more than gold ever could. They had given her the most precious gift of all, the knowledge that she could face the unknown and emerge stronger than she had ever believed possible. And in that quiet, star-filled night, Margaret felt truly free.